He's a Zelda fan? They're Zelda fans. I'm a Zelda fan. I'm sure you're a Zelda fan. Are there any other Zelda fans I should know about?
I'm out of here.
Hello, everyone. Tears of the Kingdom is just a few weeks away, and I am beyond excited. To celebrate my excitement, and there's nothing better I can be doing right now, I'm gonna camp outside Best Buy for the next few weeks until release. I'll be seeing you guys then. Farewell.
Two hours later.
I got mugged. If I can't pass my time by camping outside of Best Buy, what else can I do? Alexa, how can I pass the time until Tears of the Kingdom?
Maybe you should replay the entire Zelda series so you are refreshed for potential secrets?
Not a bad idea, but it'll take too much effort. Alexa, what else?
Maybe you can listen to the series soundtracks? That'll put you in a Ganon-slaying mood.
It would. I do like the series soundtracks, but that's not as involved. Alexa, any other ideas?
How about you waste hours of your life mooching off the hard work of actually talented people making a video for total strangers? When you die, do you really want to be known as the lost in development guy? God, you're pathetic. And fat.
What the fuck? The Legend of Zelda is an incredibly influential franchise, and laid down the foundations for some of gaming's most popular series. Being the primary influence for modern adventure games, one must ask themselves, how can something this important come to be? Well, today I'll be talking about the origins of Zelda as a series, pre-release materials, design documents, and more, so we can see how this iconic series came to fruition. It's a pretty well-known fact that The Legend of Zelda, Ocarina of Time, and Super Mario 64 were developed alongside one another, taking concepts from each other and molding them to fit within the respective games' universes. For instance, horseback riding was a feature designed for Mario 64 due to Miyamoto's insistence of its inclusion, but it was scrapped due to time constraints. Not wanting to make the work go to waste, they transferred what was finished of the horse riding mechanics to Ocarina of Time, or due to the game having a much later launch than that of 64, they were able to iron out the kinks. That's how Link got his iconic horse companion, Epona, but that's a story for another day. Mario 64 and Ocarina of Time have some of the most well-documented development histories ever, so I can't do the games justice here. But what a lot of people don't know is that it wasn't Mario 64 and Ocarina of Time that started this trend. Rather, it was the original Super Mario Bros. And The Legend of Zelda that were developed somewhat concurrently. It was while Mario was in development in 1984 that Shigeru Miyamoto began to conceptualize a new game that would have been the flagship title for the soon-to-be-released Famicom Disk System. The Disk System is a pretty weird piece of hardware. It was a peripheral for the Famicom that made use of proprietary disk to save game data, save user-created levels, and even be rewritten entirely and have a new game put on the user's disk. So with the rewriting technology in mind, he thought it would be cool to have a game where players create these mazes, save them to the disks, and then give them to their friends to explore. They had a functioning prototype made for this iteration, but the developers found that the process of making the mazes was kind of boring, especially when compared to actually exploring them, so they decided to focus on the exploration aspect of the game rather than the level creation. This is something that people really don't discuss often at all, but I have a feeling that this particular idea was conceptualized in response to a weakness of a game Miyamoto had directed previously, being Excitebike. The iconic Famicom title has level creation tools in it, and regardless of how difficult they are to use, they function well enough. The issue was, however, that the game doesn't save the level created once the game has been powered off, unless you saved it using the Famicom data recorder. The FDR is this weird-ass piece of hardware that allowed Japanese players to save their created levels on cassette tapes. It only worked with 3 first-party games being Excitebike, Wrecking Crew, and Mach Rider, but its obscure nature meant that most people wouldn't really get a chance to make use of those games' saving capabilities. With that in mind, I'd imagine Miyamoto wanted to make use of what he had learned while developing Excitebike in terms of making in-game level creation software, and create a whole game focused around that. Back on track, they saw that making levels wasn't super fun, but adored playing them, so they decided to make a game focusing on exploring labyrinths. When it comes to exploration in early video games, however, your choices were quite scarce in terms of options to look at for guidance. Super Mario Bros., for instance, had the objective be as clear as possible. You go from the left side of the screen to the right, so the opportunity for players to flex their exploration-oriented muscles were limited. More specifically, inspired by his childhood, Miyamoto chose to make the game focused on cave exploration. When he was growing up, there weren't many toys or anything for him to play with, so his childhood was forged by exploring the caves that surrounding his towns and exploring. Local kids making their own swords with sticks and the sort to play with. So instead of making a game where you knew exactly where to go, the team chose to make a game where the player is able to go wherever they want, making their own adventure essentially. It was around this point that they started working on yet another prototype, the aptly named Adventure title, where it would have had the player explore dungeons right from the title screen. This design document shows what the first few seconds of gameplay would have looked like, having a cavern open and a prompt at the bottom advising the player what their objective was. This design seemingly made it as far as potential implementation, as a single mock-up shows a scene strikingly similar to that of the development document, featuring the stone-laden path, the mountain in the distance, and even the tree line bordering the cave. The time between this point of development and the gradual transition into the final game hasn't been spoken of much, if at all. The gap I'm referring to relates to the difference in progression. While players would start immediately in a cave in this iteration, the final has the different labyrinths spread across a large world map. I'm gonna make an educated guess that what happened is something along the lines of the devs having problems in terms of connecting multiple caves. The game starts by throwing you into one, so how can they naturally progress from cave to cave? It was at this point they likely decided to have a massive map that is similarly labyrinthian, connecting the dungeons together to make the world feel more connected and realistic. That way, the game technically does start by throwing you into a maze, but that maze also happens to connect about a dozen other mazes together. Now, you can have this massive world with tons of stuff to do and loads of secrets to find, but that only matters so much when the player has no reason to do it. What's their push to explore these caves? Why do they need to do the things that they're doing? The game needed a story, and the team decided to look at one of the most well-known pieces of Chinese media for inspiration, Journey to the West, with Ganon being a clear homage to Zhu Baiji. Aside from Journey to the West's influence, the game features an incredibly simple rescue the damsel plot, through Princess Zelda being in the demonic grasp of Ganon. Famously, the game almost had an entirely different title theme, originally being Ravel's Bolero. There are a few arrangements of the song that are made within the NES's sound limitations, but I don't want to take views away from the talented people who arranged them, so I won't play any here. In the iCard I have the one I like the best for you to listen to if you are in any way interested. And that's really it for the conceptualization era of development. But there is an equally important part to take into consideration, being the point in which the game's marketing starts and release. So buckle in, fellas. We got a lot of stuff to talk about when it comes to Zelda's pre-release content. There is a lot of stuff to talk about when it comes to this game's pre-release era. There are early screenshots, concept art, development documents, and a bunch of other wacky things. So I'm just going to start with the development documents and concept art and move chronologically from there. To start, we have this image I mentioned earlier of what the game would have looked like during its adventure title phase. There are a few things to note, being that the game during this iteration was seemingly first person, not the top-down title we're familiar with. If you're not too sure what I'm talking about, think of it similar to the old Microsoft Maze screensaver, or even the Shin Megami Tensei series if you're familiar with those. The text at the bottom details what the objective for the dungeon would have been. Here they seemingly have a circle put there as a placeholder. I'd imagine that you would have had several different tasks on different dungeons, like killing X amount of enemies or simply making it to the end. Something I just noticed is if you look at the background, the mountains seem to be difficulty settings, or possibly the progression. I'm gonna go out on a limb and say that this was a difficulty selection, where the bigger the mountain you select, the more difficult the dungeon would become. I say this as the first and smallest mountain is highlighted, while the other two are seemingly grayed out. But at the same time, maybe this is just supposed to show the player stuff that will happen at some point, seeing as the mountains are labeled starting with the number 3, implying that the mountain might have been the third level of sorts? If not, then why is the easiest setting labeled with a 3? I have no earthly idea, and to be honest, I don't think it really matters, seeing as in the mock-up screenshot I showed earlier, this idea was either scrapped entirely or not deemed important enough to be included, seeing as the other two mountains are absent from the mock-up. Interestingly, it seems like the largest mountain reigned in the end, as the other two smaller ones are entirely missing. This mock-up is shrouded in a lot of mystery in general. I kind of hope that we end up seeing more of Zelda during its adventure title era, just because I have so many questions as to how it would have worked and what ideas established here eventually ended up in the final game. Exactly how far did the game get during this iteration before becoming what we know it as today? What from this era was reused in the final game? I just have a lot of questions about it, and hopefully Nintendo becomes more forthcoming with information regarding this era of development in the future. I can talk about this document and mockup for ages, to be honest, so I'm just gonna move on. So, Zelda's map is huge, especially for the time, while the dungeons themselves are also quite large, occupying a 128 tile space in a 16x8 grid. The dungeons themselves, however, have to occupy a similar space to that of the overworld. There it's a 16x16 grid instead, giving the developers a 256 tile grid to work with. The dungeons themselves all piece together to fit within this grid, and it was quite difficult for the developers to make everything fit as they needed. Doing this was incredibly efficient in terms of memory usage. Instead of having to use a bunch of different separate maps, the dungeons effectively occupy two different maps in a way. It was so efficient, as a matter of fact, that the map's designer, Takeshi Tezuka, only ended up using half the memory they needed to fill. Despite this, the developers of Miyamoto felt that the dungeons he had created for the game were so perfect, rather than creating new, bigger ones, they decided to include the second quest. For the uninitiated, the second quest is a more difficult version of Zelda, unlocked after beating the main mode that features remixed dungeons and different enemy behaviors, and the dungeon layouts all still fit together like a puzzle. This image shows the original document that Tezuka submitted of the dungeon's maps, and it is incredibly faithful to what appears in the final game. If you look at the bottom, you can see arrows indicating where the dungeon's entrances would have been, which match up with where they are in the final game. The sections that are grayed out seemingly represent secret rooms, or rooms that wouldn't appear on the full map, but Link was still able to go to through the use of secret entrances and the sort. All of them match up with the final game, with one exception being Dungeon 8, which seemingly has a scrapped room in the top right hand corner. Other than that, the map layouts are exactly the same. This document shows the second quest's maps, which are literally the exact same as the final. Once again, the grayed out areas represent spots in which Link can explore, but the map does not reflect its existence. Next, we've got this document that shows the room in which the player fights Ganon. The room appears exactly the same in the final game, down to the statues in each corner correlating to those that appear in the final. Since we're talking about boss rooms, this document shows the room in which Triforce pieces are held in the final game. The document shows all potential variants in which these would appear, seeing as in the final game there are no circumstances in which Link enters the Triforce room from above. With that said, the Triforce is shown to be a tile higher than in the final game, and it also has these shines emitting from it. Though, that could have just been something exclusively done in the drawing to indicate, hey, this is important, and not representative of anything intended to appear in the final game. This document shows a pretty basic room from a dungeon, but to those who've played the game, they should recognize this as this is one of the more memorable rooms, as this is the layout of the Wall Master room, found in the first dungeon of the first quest. Though, this layout also appears in a few more dungeons, like 2, 6, and 7 in the first quest, and in dungeons 2, 3, 5, 8, and 9 in the second. Additionally, there's this document which shows how wall masters work, using the layout of the previously mentioned document. Now this is probably one of the most interesting documents, showing how the game would have played out during its adventure title phase. This is from when a lot of aspects of the game were uncertain, but if you look right here, we have the layout of the mock-up and design doc from the beginning, meaning that that was likely the earliest thing determined. The document shows how the game would have progressed, with the player moving from floor to floor instead of moving from room to room. It also shows a dragon boss at the top, and a weird little slime fella on the right. We don't have a picture of it as far as I know, but the Iwata Asks interview that this is from also mentions a second page detailing items. Among items we got in the final game, such as compasses, bows, arrows, and boomerangs, they also briefly mentioned gold and silver, meaning that that was likely the original currency for the game. We'll talk a bit more about items in a second, but there are a few maps showing what the overworld would have looked like. Okay, this is a bad start for the overworld, but I guess I consider the caves to be part of the overworld, and if you disagree, you're wrong. Anyways, we have this picture of a design document that shows how the hidden fast travel caves would have looked, and they're pretty much identical to the final. Here we can see that comic book style text boxes were meant to indicate that NPCs were talking, and if you've seen extended tidbits of gameplay of the Japanese version of Zelda, you've probably noticed that the text there is off-center, appearing to the right of the speaking NPC. Well, it seems like that's a remnant of the scrapped text box idea, which I found pretty interesting. If you can for just a second, think back to the document that was explaining how wall masters work. Remember how I mentioned that it was a barely modified template? What the hell did I mean by that? Well, the truth is, the image you guys saw was only a small portion of the full document, the remaining 75% showing overworld map concepts. Now, none of these three have any equivalent in the final game. These all look incredibly different from anything that appears. But if you look behind the drawings, it seems that these were printout templates for dungeon designs that have been drawn over and reused for overworld design. Now, if we are looking for similarities, I guess the top left one kind of looks like J5 of the final map. And the bottom right one kind of looks like I7, but I feel like that's a stretch. The bottom left has a scenario that never appears in the final game, however, being an island which connects with other screens using bridges. Now, islands do appear in the final game, such as the famous location of the first dungeon, but this style of island, being entirely surrounded by water and having bridges connect to each side of the screen, do not appear. There is a second document of this style which shows more early maps, but these ones do actually have some concrete in-game counterparts. The bottom two seem to be different takes of the same idea. The one on the right in particular is nearly identical to I5 in the final game, while the one on the left really doesn't have a parallel, so I'm assuming it was just a different take on what would become I5. The top left one is super interesting, as based on the texture given to the ground we can pinpoint what area it was meant to appear in, being the desert. The desert is an area I always found to be totally worthless in the final game. There's nothing to do there, but it appears that originally the desert would have featured a grandiose cave entrance, with the structure we see in the center potentially being an early version of dungeon entrances. So it seems that the desert would have actually had something to do in it, rather than being as empty as it is in the final. Then the top right shows a very familiar looking layout, featuring a set of stairs alongside a cave entrance. Despite this striking me as a familiar set piece, as far as I can tell it didn't appear in the final, so it's probably just a false memory. Now, this is a wacky one. It's safe to say that it either wasn't finished, or simply made to show what certain set pieces would look like per notable location. I think that that's probably the case, seeing as there are two staircases to the right, which makes no sense from a design standpoint. And the presence of Pinnacle Rock, which is an incredibly important location, outside of where it would make sense is especially strange. Doubly so considering the presence of gravestones, which appear exclusively in the graveyard, which if you don't know, is a 6-tile area in the final game. This next one is probably the biggest and most interesting piece from the released development documents, being an early map. This is probably the earliest iteration of the map, and is wildly different from the final, so this is going to take a little bit to go over. Now, I'm assuming you're somewhat familiar with the grid system I've been using to identify sections of the map, If not, I mean, you can figure it out. I'll put the images up alongside dimensions, so it doesn't really matter that much anyways. So I'm just going to go ahead and get right into it. A1 and B1 look pretty much the same as the final game, but differences start with C1 and D1, which were originally super basic hallway type maps. This version of the map has a lot of hallway tiles, so I'm assuming that those areas got fleshed out later in development to make the world more interesting. Despite the layout looking much more bland, the stairway paths are still present in this drawing. E1 is a little bit different, originally not opening up on the right, but F1, which has Pinnacle Rock, is identical. G1, H1, and I1 are all hallway designs, but H1 still has the stairs as in the final. This next one's pretty interesting. J1's rock formation is pointing to the right instead of the left. The arrow in the final game was meant to direct the player towards Pinnacle Rock, I suspect, but it seems like it was originally meant to guide the player in the direction of K1, which in the final game, and presumably this version, holds the white sword. The leftmost entrance of K1 was probably removed for difficulty's sake. In the final game, there's a Lionel guarding the entrance to the cave, and the challenge wouldn't really exist if you can enter from the left and just sneak in. K1 is nearly identical aside from the entrances on the left and the right, but L1's different too. It has the Armos layout seen in the final, but is noticeably missing the dungeon entrance and the stairs to the south. M1, N1, and O1 are all the same as the final, but P1 seems to have not been finished at this point, which is a trend you'll start seeing on the right side of the map. A2, B2, and C2 all look similar, but are missing the trees seen in the final version. C2 in particular is pretty interesting, as instead of having the trees, it features a boulder. D2's the same, and E2 has an arrow that points to the left, which makes me wonder if the boulder seen in C2 was originally another dungeon entrance. Anyways, F2, G2, and H2 seem to be much the same, though I can't tell if the river's there in the sketched map. I2, J2, K2, and L2 are all identical to the final, except that L2 connects with M2 in the final game, while that path is missing in the development document. With that said, M2, N2, and from what I can tell, O2 all look identical to the final. P2, once again, isn't finished. There are a few scribbles, but I can't really tell what it's supposed to be. A3, B3, and C3 all look the exact same, C3 even featuring the dungeon entrance seen in the final game. With that in mind, perhaps L1 missing the dungeon entrance was intentional, and it originally wasn't supposed to have a dungeon. D3, E3, and F3 are all the same, aside from E3 and F3 swapping the ridges of the mountain between the tiles. G3 is slightly different, having a jut of mountain added in the final, but H3 and I3 look the exact same. These next ones are weird as this is where the desert is in the final game, but here they're totally different. Instead of being open and empty, there are narrow hallways. So J3, K3, and L3 are different from the final game. M3 is very close to the final game, which features another boulder, but in the final it's open on the left, while this document shows a wall blocking that side off. N3 is the same as the final, O3 looks identical, and once again, there's nothing discernible from the P tile. A4, B4, C4, D4, E4, F4, G4, and H4 are all identical, H4 even featuring the dungeon entrance. I4 is still the same, but J4 is where stuff starts to be different again, which originally featured a straight hallway instead of the fairy fountain seen in the final game. K4 is different, and it looks like it would have had something of note, but the scan is such low resolution I can't tell for sure. L4 appears to be a little different, but M4 gets us back into our comfort zone with yet another identical layout, once again featuring the dungeon entrance as it appears in the final game. N4 is different, being much narrower than the final's more open design, but O4 is once again identical, and for the first time we can see what a P tile looks like. It's the exact same as the final. Okay, we're halfway there. We can make it! A5, B5, and C5 are all identical. C5 even still features the hidden dungeon entrance as it appears in the final. D5 is very different, and it features an arrow which is likely pointing to the hidden dungeon. This gives more credence to the idea that the mysterious C2 rock was a scrap dungeon entrance, which was eventually moved to L1 or potentially another location. E5 is similar, albeit missing a pathway to the left. F5 is the same and still features the dungeon entrance, and G5 is also identical. H5 and I5 are still the same, except I5 got widened just a little bit in the final game, and it also added a southern path, J5 is nearly identical, but it was widened and once again had an additional path added on the bottom. Interestingly, K5 is the exact same as the final. This is kind of weird as it connects to the area that would have become the desert, but as we all know, the desert's missing in this version. L5 is also totally different, but once again, interestingly, this layout seems to have not been scrapped entirely, just moved to M6 in the final game with a little bit of tweaking. M5 is identical, N5 is different, though it's strikingly similar to tiles just below it in the final game, and O5 and P5 are also identical. A6 is weird. It looks very similar, but the stairs are seemingly in the center of the screen, yet on the right side it looks like there's a set of stairs there too? B6 is similar in idea, but notably has 2 extra paths not seen in the final, one of which leads to the similar, but noticeably narrower, C6. D6 is also different. It has a similar layout, but different object placement. It has 5 trees in total on the left and right sides, while the final has 3 spread across the center, and the right path is missing. E6 and F6 are the same, but G6 has a very different layout on the right side, having a narrow path instead of the final's open pathway with 6 trees. H6 and I6 are similar, but have different tree layouts. I6 is also missing the northern path. J6 is once again very similar, albeit also missing a northern path, and the leftmost pathway was widened. Heck, the lake is even vaguely visible in the sketch. K6 is also similar, but the right side is super different and is missing the 2 trees. Though there is a strange block that might represent a tree seen in the design sketch. L6 is totally different, though M6 looks pretty similar to the final version. N6 is different and has a really lame crossroads design, and O6 is similar, but it clearly got modified. Though here you can tell that the cave is roughly in the same location as it is in the final game. P6 is different and features a plain, straight wall in the concept map, while the final game has identical ridges to that of P5. A7 is similar, though the right path was widened, and B7 is totally different, which means the Lost Woods mechanic in the final game probably didn't exist then. And although the left half of C7 looks different due to the additional paths in B7, the right side looks identical. This said, D7 is different and doesn't even have the trees seen in the final. E7 looks much the same, albeit the usual funny business with the paths going on, and F7 is nearly identical, except that it's missing the rightmost path and it was blocked off with walls. G7 is pretty much the same, save the left side due to the lack of a pathway, and H7 is almost identical, except that the cave location was seemingly moved over to the right, and this little nub was added. I7 is super similar, except the tree layout was different and the right path is missing. J7 is different as well, not having a left path and only having 1 tree instead of the 5 in the final. K7 looks practically the same, aside from the right side being opened up in the final game. L7 is pretty much the same, aside from the usual paths being narrowed stuff that's seemingly everywhere. But M7 and N7 are totally different. M7 seemingly featured one of the handful of fast travel locations, which was probably removed because of how close it is to the one in J8. O7 looks similar, aside from the missing right pathway, and P7 is the same way, once again, just missing a left pathway. Home stretch, good god, this map is killing me. A8 is different, missing the dead trees seen in the final, and B8 marks the great return of hallway design. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure that we're all glad to see him back, but don't get too attached, because he was changed entirely in the final. C8 is identical, but D8 is very different, being super narrow instead of how open the final one is. E8 is interesting, as the Armos layout is different in the design document, but you can very vaguely make out a little drawing that shows the dungeon entrance. We get some levity for 2 tiles, as F8 and G8 are the exact same as the final game, but H8 is different. This is probably the most iconic tile in the entire game as it's the starting point. The left cave was moved up in the final game. I8 looks similar but clearly has different tree layouts, and J8 looks very much the same, though it seems like it's been modified at this point from the original vision based on the varied levels of darkness from the sketches. The fan favorite hallway is back, but he's been found dead, as this is the last time we'll be seeing him in K8, as he was opened up to make the final Tektite combat less of a pain in the ass. I'm exhausted at this point, so L8 and P8 are the exact same, except L8's missing its northmost path. And that is it! Good God! I have a few final conclusions to make with this map, mainly regarding why it was changed. The number one reason I say is because it was way too plain and narrow at this point. Though it features its open areas, the vast majority of tiles were designed like hallways, and as a result it would be super boring to explore. Regarding the dungeon's locations, a lot of them are the same, though it seems like C2 was originally a dungeon that was eventually moved over to L1, probably because the overusage of arrow hints. The only two special entrances that are unaccounted for are the ones in the mysterious P1 through 3, but we can't really see what was there originally, so I don't want to make conclusions one way or another. Okay, moving on. Surely we're done with... Jokes aside, this one isn't as bad, and it only features half the tiles seen in the last one. Starting with H, on to O, though G is partially visible. With that in mind, I'm gonna go ahead and get started with H1, which is identical. In fact, a lot of these are the same as the final, with a few very minor differences here and there. I1 is also the same, but J1 is weird. It shows the magical sword, which in the final game is located in the graveyard, but it lines up with the location of the magic sword in the second quest, which I guess means whatever's in blue is representative of its location in the second quest. Moving on, K, L, M, N, and O1 are all the same. The second row is identical until you reach M2, where the staircase is shown to be on the bottom row instead of on the top in the final. Similarly, N2 had the stair location moved, having them appear at the movable rocks location instead of on the side like in the final. The entire third row is the same as the final, and so is the fourth, aside from M4 featuring a different color palette, using the brown palette while the final uses the green. Keep this in mind for later. The fifth row is nearly identical, except J5 having the cave entrance moved, and once again, M5 using the brown palette instead of the final's green. Remember this one too. H6 is different, having a nearly identical tree layout, except for the fact that the left side is still using the narrow version we saw with the previous map. Other than that, the rest of row 6 is the same. Row 7 has the biggest difference, being an entirely different I7 in the sense that the right path is missing in this early map, which as a result means J7 is missing its left path and those 5 trees are absent. Other than that, row 7 is the same still. And lastly, the final and 8th row is once again the exact same. Okay, that does it for maps. No jokes, no trickery, that's it for the map stuff for now, for good. Good God, I'm exhausted and need to pick me up, so let's talk about something a little more different and a little more interesting from the design documents, being enemies in the sort. But before that, there's one last thing I want to mention. I decided to go through and recreate a full beta version of the first map we discussed. It's been created using sprites of the final game, and I thought it would be a cool additional resource for those who are interested to look at it. So if you want a full, high-quality version of my recreation, just go to my website, www.mamaluigi.com, to find it. As cool as recreating an image of the map is, I think a fully playable version would be cool, for education's sake, as this map is historically important, I feel. This may or may not be a hint at something I'm working on, so if that's something that might interest you, stay tuned. Anyways, enemies. There are a lot of documents showing enemies, so I'm just gonna pick one and go from there. This first one isn't too notable, simply showing the enemies that appear within dungeons, and how they would be stored in memory it appears. So from left to right we have Zol, Gel, Rope, Stalfos, Wallmaster, Likes, Gibdo, Wizrobe, Tektites, Pole's Voice, Vire, Keese, Bubble, Gorilla, Spike Trap, Lanmola, Darknuts, the Statues, Aquamantis, Dodongo, Digdogger, Gleeok, Gleeok's Head, Goma, and Manhandla. As I mentioned earlier, these are all enemies that can be found within the game's dungeons, but there are a few that are missing. Patra isn't here, which means it might have been added later on in development. and Moldorm doesn't look like it's here either. Though, its similarities with Lanmola in terms of design might mean that the two are different interpretations of the same idea, being this sketch. This is a weird one, and it's kind of hard to discern what it's showing, but I'll try my best. The image is seemingly showing how item drops would work. In the final game, it's depending on how many enemies you kill without getting hit, which enemies you kill, and all that kind of crap. Explaining it's beyond the scope of this video, however, but from what I can tell, this chart looks wildly different from how the final ones work. But then again, I'm not super familiar with how item drops work in the first place, so I might be wrong, so take that with a grain of salt. What's interesting are the drawings of enemies beneath the chart, and while it's blurry and not super clear, we can still pick out which enemies they are. It's split in half, the left side representing overworld enemies, while the right side shows dungeon enemies. On the right side we have Stalfos, Gibdo, Rope, Pole's Voice, Gorilla, Darknut, another Darknut, Vire, Gorilla again, Zol, Wallmaster, Wizrobe, the head of Lanmola, Tektites, and then another Wizrobe. Beneath them is a section showing enemies that don't drop anything as they can't be killed, being a boulder, bubble, trap, and one of Gleok's heads. The left side's where things get interesting, due to the presence of an enemy that does not belong in the overworld subset. To start, we have Tektite, Octorok, Moblin, Peahat, what I think is a Genie, Lionel, Zola, another Octorok, another Moblin, Moldorm, Armos, then a Peahat and Lionel again. Beneath these guys is yet another area showing enemies that usually don't drop anything. It shows a Gel, Keese, Like, Lanmola, Moldorm, and a scratched out enemy that I can't really tell what it is. Okay, so to address the elephant in the room, Moldorm and Lanmola did coexist at this point, which disproves my previous theory. But the weird thing is that Moldorm appears alongside enemies that would appear in the overworld, and not within dungeons like he does in the final. Now, this seems to imply that Moldorm was originally just supposed to appear in the wild, which seems really weird considering he only appears in like, what, 3 dungeons in the final game? So yeah, I think that's pretty neat. I assume it would have gone in the desert area, seeing as it only appears alongside the ground texture used there within dungeons. And that would also explain why the final game's desert's so barren. Maybe it was opened up assuming the player would confront Moldorm there? I don't know, so I'm just going to move on to the next document showing even more enemies. This one's just more of the same, honestly, showing the enemies found within dungeons alongside their bosses. But what's interesting is how the bosses appear. So, the bosses have these nutso circles surrounding them. I don't know why they're here, but maybe they have to do with killing methods. Aquamentus and Gleok are killed by using the sword alone, Goma and Dodongo are killed using specific items, and Digdogger and Manhandla are weird? They don't really fit into the scheme I described. After all, Digdogger's invincible until you use the flute, but Manhandla can be killed with just about everything. Maybe the circle's referring to post-flute Digdogger, but at that point I'm just throwing crap at walls, so I'm just gonna go out on a limb and say that the circles are not important. Ganon's drawn as a silhouette here, which was probably intentional as the silhouette matches pretty much perfectly with his finalized appearance. I would say this was just done to keep Ganon a mystery. What I'm more curious about is why the hell is there a soul-piercing eye barely visible right next to Ganon? What is that doing there? Ugh. I'm just gonna move on to the next one, before this thing finishes absorbing my soul. I saved the single coolest internal document for last. This is the final one, and it has a lot of stuff to talk about, like cut enemies, items, and even a cut boss. So this document has a lot of stuff. I'm just gonna approach it the way I normally do, go from top to bottom, from left to right. Starting off, we have half a sphere, which doesn't appear in the final game. This could be a magic orb for the old man to use, but more realistically, I think that this might be the early gold currency mentioned earlier. It looks like it has a ridge surrounding it, and the shine could just be extra detail on the coin. Next, we have an arrow that looks pretty much identical to the final version. This next one, however, is weird, as the top half is clearly a bow, but the bottom half is part of a map. Perhaps this map sketch was meant to represent how the dungeon map appears in the pause screen, but the final map is just a folded sheet of paper. Next to that, we have a candle, which while candles do appear in the final game, the drawing shows a much more detailed revision. I have no idea what this is. It looks like a whistle with a slide at the top, but I'm not 100% sure. If anyone has any concrete ideas to what this is, let me know in the comments. This, however, I'm quite certain of what it is. It is a log. It seems like this is from the early work on the raft, and the question mark seems to hint that they didn't know exactly how to represent one. Next we have a sword, but above that is a far more interesting magic lamp, which obviously doesn't show up in the final game. Next to that is a tunic that also doesn't appear in the final game, as the tunic Link is wearing is determined by which ring he has equipped. Then we have a heart container, a potion, a key, and the master key, all appearing pretty much the same as the final. Then we have some scribbles. I can't tell what they're supposed to be, but next to that we have a piece of meat that appears horizontally oriented, while in the final game they're vertically oriented. Then we have half a sandwich. This was probably cut in order to maintain the game's fantasy feeling. Not to imply sandwiches didn't exist in medieval times or anything, I just think it would be distracting if I was exploring some fantasy world and then boom, there's a Subway footlong right in front of me. Next we have some drawings of explosion clouds and bombs, which all look pretty much the same as the final. Then some scribbles again, and then a few drawings that I think are different takes on Keese. Vires appear later on in the document, so these can't be those guys. It seems like they were originally more moth-esque, but gradually turned more into bats as the designs got refined. Then we have a circle. I'm gonna be honest, I have no idea what this is supposed to be, so I'm not even gonna speculate on that one. Then we have a few different takes on the spike trap, showing one with diagonal blades, one with 4 blades, and then one which is the one we ended up with, having 4 spikes. This next one is super interesting, as it shows a larger variant of the fairy that does not appear in the final game. And right next to her is a larger variant of the old man, where you can clearly see where he's holding a staff, which I find pretty cool. Then we have some fire, and right next to that is an unused fire-based enemy that looks to be pretty much identical to the fire enemies from Donkey Kong, which I found pretty weird. Then there's this fan-like thing that was scrapped, and next to that we have yet another scrapped enemy, being this cockroach, with associated sideways moving sprites for it. Next to that, we have yet another unused enemy, being Death himself with a scythe. Now, skeleton enemies do appear in the final game, so I'm inclined to speculate that this became the Stalfos, but the weapon used is totally different, so it can be an entirely unrelated idea. Next, we have what I first thought was a buzzsaw, but upon looking more closely, this is almost certainly Dig Dogger, evident by the spikes coming out of the side and the circle in the center. After that, we have yet another cut enemy, this time looking like the gyroids from Animal Crossing. Well, not quite, but the two likely share the same inspiration, being Haniwa statues, which are these Japanese clay statues usually found alongside ancient grave sites. Next to it is something. It's just a nub. Maybe it's supposed to be an upside down mushroom because this was designed to be the anti-Mario? I don't know, it seems unimportant though. The next one's similar to the Haniwa enemy, as this enemy is also unused and also based on ancient Japanese statue, instead of Haniwa being Dogu. However, unlike Haniwa, Dogu would later see reintroduction into the Zelda series in Breath of the Wild, where one can be found in Purah's lab, so that's pretty cool. Next we have some sketches of Wallmaster, as well as the blocks seen in dungeons, and then some Vires as I mentioned earlier. Then we have this groovy son of a gun busting a move on the document, seemingly being a scrapped enemy. It looks very similar to the Gibdos in terms of build, but if you remove the limbs it just becomes a Zol, so I'm leaning more towards this being an early version of those. Next, we have Gibdo, who looks pretty much the same as the final game, except that the developers included an unimplemented back sprite for the character. Next, we have another totally unused enemy, being this weird, one-eyed monster in a hood. It looks like this was totally scrapped to the uninitiated, but I actually think that this enemy was split into 2 different enemies. The The Wizrobe, as they wear cloaks and are wearing jewelry in the final game, similar to this drawing, but also the Guineas, as they also appear with only one eye. Now this is where we get into some really weird stuff, being this ox-like boss that wouldn't appear in the final game. It seems like the decision to scrap this enemy had been made at this point, based on the giant X adorning the sprite, seemingly being replaced by Dodongo. Beneath the ox, we have these sprites that look insignificant, but appear to be experimentation with the spikes that appear on the back of Aquamentus and on the outer shell of Digdogger. Next to it, we have this front-facing dragon head that probably became Gleeok in the final game, and then next to that we have Aquamentus appearing in all his glory. While Aquamentus looks pretty much finalized at this point, one thing to note here is that he's drawn with large wings, while in the final game his wings are quite small. I wouldn't really count on this being something intended to appear, however, as the question mark next to the wings seems to imply that they were put there just to see if they would work. And if you look closely, you can notice the small wings that we eventually got in the final game. On the edge of the document, we can see some additional sketches, showing a run cycle for the previously mentioned Ox enemy, but on the right we have some sketches for different designs of the magical watch, showing an iteration that shows a grandfather clock, and alarm, and then the stopwatch design that appears in the final game. And finally, there's a drawing of the stairs that is practically identical to its appearance in the final game! And that magical staircase leads us out on design documents. This section alone is about as long as an entire video in of itself. This has been a huge video. So let's make it even larger by looking at even more pre-release materials. This time we're looking at pre-release screenshots and footage of the game and comparing it to the final to find differences. There are also a lot of these, and each screenshot has a crazy amount of differences in them. I'm just going to go by the order the cutting room floor lists them for my sake. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, children of preferably ages 13 and older because man, Kappa is a pain in my ass. I present to you the most powerful object in Nintendo history, the Power Triangle. Here, they just straight up call the Triforce a Power Triangle, which is just funny, but there are a few more differences to be seen. For one, the player has the red ring equipped, which should give Link the red tunic, right? Well, a little known fact about Zelda, several items share the palette with Link, namely the bow, arrow, and raft. They all share the palette with Link. So when Link has the red ring, and as a result the red tunic, one would expect the string of the bow, the rope tying the raft together, and the stick in the arrow to be red, right? Well, observant viewers would have noticed that it's using the white palette, which in the final game is associated with the blue ring, which Link does not have equipped. This is also seen in how Link's map icon, the dot, is white instead of the expected red, further showing that he indeed does have the white tunic equipped. Now, this seems to imply that originally the red ring is what gave Link the white tunic, or even more likely, that the blue and red ring simply used the same sprite at this point in development, which means the red ring and blue ring look identical sprite-wise. This screenshot has yet another oddity, being that in the spot where the ladder is in the final game, here, there's a weird yellow-brown checkered square instead. Now, this is almost certainly a placeholder, seeing as across all the documents we looked at, the ladder was missing. As a result, we can somewhat safely assume that it was an item added later on in the development process. The UI itself has a few oddities too, like the bomb counter being missing entirely, and the player has the magic key equipped. Despite this, instead of displaying an A next to the key counter like the final, they simply have a 1, which is just weird. However, the biggest thing to notice here actually has to do with the text. This is obviously a screenshot of the Japanese version, based on the Japanese text beneath the inventory icon. And anyone who knows anything about Japanese Zelda is that it uses an entirely different font than the English version. And the font here isn't the Japanese font. The Japanese font is much thinner and more widely spaced apart, while the English font is thicker and closer together, which is what we see here. Despite this font being nearly identical to that of the English version, the I and the R are a little bit different. The I having longer serifs at the top than the final, and the R was just a little bit thinner. There's just a couple more weird things here, both having to do with the items. The wand appears red here, while in the final it's blue. This is even seen where in the manual the wand is drawn as red. The last one is that the meat sprite's different. It was much thicker and larger, and the spot detailing across the sprite was also different. Here's a recreation of the meat sprite, and here's a recreation of the red wand. Other than that, the image does not have any other differences, so I'm just going to move on to the next screenshot. This screenshot is very interesting for a few reasons. First, the Octoroks use slightly different sprites, having their eyes be more narrow while the final has more open eyes. Just like the last two sprites, I created this restoration to replicate what it would have looked like in higher quality. The map's layout here is also different than the final. This is a screenshot of G6 in the final game, but it has a more narrow pathway in this screenshot. In fact, if you guys can recall the map drawing from earlier in the video, this is the exact same layout of G6 as seen in that document, which to me seems to imply that this map got as far as seeing implementation. That means that there's a possibility of a build of Zelda 1 existing within Nintendo's archives, which features this wildly different map. Also, if you zoom in on Link here, he uses a slightly different sprite, where the sword is held higher and as a result it looks like it's shooting from his mouth. And he has more hair in the back, which is missing from other screenshots. This recreation I made should show how weird it looks compared to the final. This image should ring a few bells for those who've been paying attention. In the more finalized map I discussed in the design document section, I mentioned how M5 and M4 have the same layout as the final game, but are using a different color scheme. The final uses green, while the drawing uses brown, which is mirrored in this screenshot, which is identical in terms of layout, but once again, uses brown colored mountains instead of the green seen in the final. Link is also seen using his sword while using his basic idle sprite, which in the final game isn't possible, as using the sword switches Link to the second frame of his walk cycle, which has his feet extended back and out. Weirdly enough, it also seems like Link is missing his shield from this version of the sprite, which is something that's seen in several other screenshots from this period. Now, this screenshot has, well, a lot of stuff going on. It's a little weird to look at if you're familiar with the final game. So to start, Link looks drunk to say the very least. His slouch is really weird considering his lack of a shield. I went through and attempted a recreation of this sprite and ended up with this as the closest looking thing. It's hard to make out a lot of the smaller details in the sprite, though this looks the closest, seeing as it is literally the final sprite, minus the shield, and like 2 more pixels. Now, that is not the only thing in this picture that feels like it's from an alternate dimension. The UI is still missing the bomb counter, and it still uses the American font, but, does anyone else see this shit? The map is weird! It's ethereal to see this! Like, the layout is the same. As we established earlier, the dungeon maps faced very little modification. Seemingly the first designs are what they settled on. But Moon? Moon? Why isn't it called Level 2? Wait, was this originally the first dungeon? Look at Link's life counter. If Dungeon 1 was complete, shouldn't he have 4 heart pieces? Okay, let's take a step back for a second. Moon. Zelda 1's dungeons all have names based on what the shape of the map is. Dungeon 1 is the eagle, Dungeon 2 is the moon, Dungeon 3 is the manji. I know what it looks like, but I swear, the manji is a Japanese symbol of love. It's kind of ironic considering, you know, but anyways, the names are real and they are in the game's manual, but the names are never mentioned in-game, and instead are just called level whatever. So seeing the dungeon's name mentioned in-game is weird as hell. It was probably changed to the level thing in the final game to guide players in the dungeon order and how certain items are needed to do certain ones. Like a few later dungeons require the ladder, for instance. So from a design standpoint, I'm glad they changed it. But at the same time, having them show the dungeon's name at some point in-game would clear up some confusion. Dungeon 3 in particular because, you know. But the map gets even weirder, because am I stupid, or are those squares? The final game uses rectangles to identify tiles on the map, so the fact that they're squares here is wacky. Now, this might not seem like a big deal, but the rectangles in the final are the size of 2 of the squares seen here. So does this mean that the dungeons were originally twice as long? Maybe? There isn't anything to imply it other than the fact that they're squares, particularly if you look over on the edges of the map. Each side has 2 squares there. I'd venture to say that if they were truly representative of the actual map, they would have probably had some variation there. Maybe make the image of a moon look a little more detailed? It's especially weird considering that the design documents show the maps with the final grid size. So this probably doesn't mean anything important, and might just be a weird quirk of the build. That is what I would be saying if it wasn't for this little detail I just noticed. So, the part of this map that this tile occupies in the final game is in a part of the dungeon that is 2 rooms wide. Why is this important? Well, there are rooms to the left and the right of the room Link is currently in, which as a result means that the dungeon in this part was at least 3 rooms wide, right? Unless we're to assume that the door on the left doesn't lead anywhere, but that's a stretch I feel. So there is evidence to suggest that the dungeons were originally at least a little bit different. And as it stands, I have no reason to believe that the map isn't reflective of the dungeon itself. It's conspiracy theory time, ladies and gentlemen. Something tinfoil hat. I don't know. But what if this build that these screenshots are from a version where they had the layouts of the first quest maps finalized, but before the second quest's inclusion? Now, this sounds crazy, and I know that this contradicts some previously revealed information, particularly if we go back to the conceptualization era. There's some stuff that was said there, according to the developers, that entirely contradicts my argument, but just hear me out on this. I'm going to go a little bit more in depth later, just because there's a lot of stuff that comes up later that kind of supports my idea. I just want to introduce the idea right now, since we're already talking about how weird the map is. And that's that. Is this really what I'm doing with my life? Which, as I said earlier, implies that they were originally double the length as the final. But wait, Square fans, don't move a muscle, because there's another weird thing going on with squares, being that the blocks look different here too. I once again recreated it, and the sprite here was much more elaborate than the final version. Lastly, the key position is different in the final game. It spawns as close to the center as it can in the final, while here it spawns in the top left corner of the room. Those last sets of screenshots were from a February 1985 issue of Amiga magazine, but these next few come from a March issue. This one is much closer to the final game. Link has a shield, although it is the magic shield, but his sprite looks pretty much identical. The font also looks closer to the Famicom Disk System version used in the final Japanese release, except for the serifs on the eye. The key icon here shows a blue heart to signify the magical key, instead of the one seen in the last set, and instead of the A seen in the final. And finally, the final game added an additional 2 rows of trees on the right side. Other than that though, it's the same as the final. This one has the exact same HUD differences as earlier, with a few more differences to the map and the sprites themselves. So, the map has a different layout on the left side, having a tree at the end move up a tile, and then another one added 2 tiles below it. And the Octorocks are using yet another different sprite, lacking the dot at the top seen in the final game. Once again, my recreation is on screen. This is a weird screenshot, and I mean a really weird screenshot. So, small change first, the pixels between the tiles are red here instead of how the final uses blue. That doesn't really matter though. What's weird is the business going on in the top left of the UI. If you look closely, or better yet, at an angle, you can see that for whatever reason, Famicom decided to mark over the map with a Sharpie or something. If that isn't weird enough though, the map here is the one from the Moon Dungeon, which as I said earlier, belongs to Dungeon 2 in the final game, not Dungeon 1 as it's listed here. I previously speculated that the moon might have originally been the first dungeon, based on the fact that Link only has 3 hearts in the previous screenshot, and if he had completed Dungeon 1 prior, he would have to have 4 hearts instead. Well, it seems like I'm a genius, because right above the marked out dungeon is, guess what? Level 1, proving me right. Now that about covers it for pre-release materials, but we have just a few more things to look at, being a few early sprites for enemies. To start, we have a Stalfos, which looks super different when compared to the final games. His swords are thinner, his design is much simpler, his head flip-flops, he's blue, all that. Now, I usually like to make my own mock-ups, but this time I'm using the ones the cutting room floor uses, being created by user French Orange there. If I made my own, they would have looked the same as theirs anyways, so yeah, shoutouts to French Orange. They're a talented pixel artist and a frequent contributor to the cutting room floor. Links to their Twitter are down below, so please be sure to show them some love for the great work and for making my life easier. Next, we have this Wallmaster, who looks pretty similar, but features some key differences. The shading on the pinky and the index finger are different. The index finger has this weird line going through it. And on the back of the hand, the spots aren't just white, but there's also dark blue spots. There's also this early key sprite, which just looks a little bit silly to me. The eyes are smaller, the ears aren't present, it's missing its, I guess, legs at the bottom, and as a result the spokes of the wings are much closer to the center, whereas the final has them be further out. Then we have this wildly different sprite for the ropes, which looks totally different except for the fact, it's still a snake. I'm just gonna put the two up on screen at the same time. You can pick out the differences for yourself. The only thing I'm gonna point out is it looks more like a cobra, so here, have 5 seconds to look at it in silence. Are you done yet? Okay, cool. Moving on, here's another rope sprite where he's mean mugging the hell out of us. Us, as in us at home. Not Link, the player. He has a grudge against us. Other than that, it's practically identical to the final below the neck. This is supposed to be Gleeok's disembodied head. And let me be the first to say, what the hell? It looks nothing like Gleeok as we know him, which might make you think Gleeok looks different too. But no, he looks the exact same as the final in the magazine. Moral of the story? He looks gross here. The flames look like a beard, which is just odd. Maybe this means Gleeok looked different early on? I don't know. I'm not even going to entertain this idea with a mock-up. So just imagine this Shrek-face thing trying to be intimidating. Final Gleeok, based and cool. Beta Gleeok, cringe and lame. And beta, obviously. Here's the Dark Nut. Wait, I think they're Iron Knuckles in Zelda 1. Ah, damn it! Just pretend I called them Iron Knuckles earlier, whatever. Anyway, this one looks different at first. Notably, the shield is plain and using a white outline, and is missing the totally not religious symbol seen in the final game. The sword is thinner, and his shoulder pad is red instead of the final's white. We have this sprite of a Pole's voice. They're all pretty close to the final, it's missing its whiskers. And that does it for enemies. Except for 2 more which I'm saving to mention later because they have to do with something I'll be talking about. But it turns out that there are 4 more things to mention. These images being taken from a promotional video Nintendo put out to help promote the game's release. Since I'm talking about enemies, I'm gonna go ahead and mention this one. It's a boss fight against my man, Aquamentus. He looks really different here. To point out a few differences, his spikes were green, his belly was shaded with shadow rather than continuing the white of his stomach, the separation on his back leg is missing, and his eye doesn't have whites like in the final. Instead, it's a 3-pixel spot. It seems like his horn was green, and his wings might have been white too. In fact, if you go to the manual for the NES release of the game and go to the pages with bosses, by Aquamentus you can see that the manual uses this exact early version of the sprite, featuring a green horn, white wings, and the less detailed eyes. I made this recreation out of respect for him. I don't know why I said out of respect, I just like Aquamentus a lot. But observant viewers would have also noticed that the blocks behind him are the exact same ones from the pre-release screenshots I mentioned earlier. This is weird because in the same video, a clip is shown where Link is fighting Patra, but here a more finalized sprite is used, albeit with different shading. Once again, here's a mock-up. This screenshot might not look too interesting to some, seeing as it just removes some tektites and stones, and adding some Armos in their place. But if you take a second and remember the early map sketch I was talking about earlier, this room matches up with the version shown there. I just thought that was cool. It's not too important, as this is one of the rooms that was barely different anyways. But it's cool to see that the map was still in use as far out as this build, which is by far the most finalized build we've seen so far. For the last pre-release screenshot, we have one of the most infamous beta concepts to ever exist, being the fact that originally, instead of just being given the sword, the old man originally gave the player the choice between the sword or a boomerang at the beginning of the game. This is weird for a few reasons. So first, in the final game the boomerang does not deal damage to enemies. All it does is slow them down. So this seems to imply that the boomerang originally would have been capable of slaying foes. This is somewhat related, but it might also relate to how the enemy boomerangs thrown by gorillas can hurt Link. I used to find the fact that theirs do damage while the players don't weird, but it seems that this might be why. Secondly, what exactly does this mean when it comes to upgrading equipment? Would the player find the sword in the place of the boomerang in the dungeons? Would the boomerang have 3 stages like the sword? Hell, would you have just not gotten the sword or boomerang? I don't know, honestly. It's a baffling thing to see, as anyone who played Zelda before knows that this image makes very little sense. Now, I know that I said that that was the last pre-release screenshot of the game, but that doesn't mean that that's it for pre-release materials as a whole. In fact, there's one more piece of pre-release material to discuss, but instead of the game itself, it has to do with the box art actually, and it was really recently discovered. Now, here I have my black box collection. I have 29 out of the 30. I'm missing Stack Up. It's one of the more expensive ones. I'll get it at some point. I would actually like to make a video covering all of these games at one point. I think it'd be kind of interesting, so stay tuned if you want to see that. But if I were to tell you, among the ranks of Super Mario Brothers, Balloon Fight, Duck Hunt, Clu Clu Land, who can forget Clu Clu Land? The Legend of Zelda was originally meant to be among them and have black box styled box art. When the NES launched in America, Nintendo used box art that fans have dubbed the Black Box series of games, which were games where the artwork showed this, well, black box surrounding the art. The art itself is interesting too. A primary cause for the North American game market crash in the 80s had to do with game box artwork often being misleading. You would have box art showing a gorgeous space battle scene, but when the player puts on the game, it's just 2 blocks going at it. The box art as seen here shows Link in his white tunic fighting off Gibdos in a keys as a key appears behind them. And this is pretty badass, I'm not gonna lie. Black box artwork is one of the most iconic aspects of the NES's library, so it's neat to see that one of the system's most iconic titles was originally meant to be one. That was, well, a lot of stuff. A lot of cool stuff. So this next section is going to be another doozy in terms of content. I kept mentioning that the Japanese version had a different font and certain other things seen within the footage, while weird to us English players, matches up with the Japanese version. So what did I mean by that? Buckle in. Hunker down. Other synonyms for get ready, as this next section we take a look at localization differences. Alright, so this is the part of the video where I give you all additional resources. Because can you believe it, this video is already long as hell. I mean, just look down there at the slider on YouTube. Good God! With that said, The Legend of Zelda has a bunch of localization differences, and differences between versions. Far too many for me to list every single last difference here. So, if you check in the iCard, there's a video by She Says, the creator of Boundary Break, that goes in a little more depth on localization differences. Particularly, I found the part where he talks about the differences between packaging internationally to be interesting. It's a quick 15-minute video, so if you're at all interested in something like that and want to dip your toes in a little bit deeper than what I do here, go check that out. Now, to you absolute maniacs out there that want to know just about every change made, the reason behind it, and a bunch of other cool things, I actually have a product to recommend. Being the first book in the Legends of Localization series. I've had the book for quite a bit now and can attest to its quality. Legends of Localization is a book series made by professional video game translator and localizer Clyde Mandelin. who's probably most well known for his work on the unofficial Mother 3 translation he did. This is someone who knows what they're talking about. He's worked on the industry in big games like Kingdom Hearts 2, I believe, and he's done work on Japanese manga and anime. So if there's anyone's word you should take on this stuff, it's his. The book goes over a bunch of stuff. Text changes, manual, font differences. He does the whole 9 yards, and it is a great read. There's also a book on Earthbound he did, which, I can also attest to the quality of. And he recently released a book on Undertale, which is pretty interesting, as instead of taking a Japanese game and localizing it for an English-speaking audience, it's the other way around. Now, I haven't got my hands on Undertales yet, though I am planning on picking it up very soon, but I've heard and seen nothing but great things about it. Links to all 3 can be found in the description. They have the physical versions like I own, and digital copies too. So if you're even remotely interested in this kind of stuff, I can guarantee that this is something you'll find cool. Full transparency here, this video is not sponsored or anything, I don't even know the people behind it, but this is a project I believe in, and the documentation of gaming history is something I find incredibly important. I mean, obviously. Something as seemingly small as a few different lines of text here and there have troves of history behind them, and I find it fascinating, and it's something that we as a community should strive to preserve. That aside, I will only be covering substantial differences between versions. Things such as music, sound effects, significant text differences, sprite changes, enemy behavior changes, and honestly things I just find funny. A lot of Zelda music sounds totally different in the FDS version. I'm not going to play the NES version as we discuss them. I assume you're all at least somewhat familiar with them to some extent, so that'd be a waste of time. Now, I'm not going to play all the tracks back to back either. I'm going to sprinkle them throughout this section so we don't have like a 5-minute period of nothing but music. But I'm going to start with one, being the title theme. Since I'm on the subject of the title screen, we should go ahead and tackle a few differences seen there. The text scroll at the beginning shows the items of the game, and most of these are the same, except for one. The Book of Magic being called a Bible! NOA has policies against religious imagery in their games. If you've seen my Mother video, however, you know that sometimes things sneak in despite the restrictions. So, despite the name of the Book of Magic being changed, anyone who's played the game before knows that Christian imagery is everywhere. Crosses are on the shields in the game, on both Link and the enemies. But even though they changed the name of the Bible, it still has a cross on its cover, so I don't really think that the change affects much. If I had to guess why Nintendo has these restrictions, it was probably because some people could see it as disrespectful to have their religions in games where, you go around and slay goblins and stuff. It could be interpreted as tasteless. So I think it's probably for the best that they removed it. Zelda in general is home to a lot of this kind of censorship. Jesus was full stop canon in the Zelda universe, and Christianity was the predominant in-game religion prior to Ocarina of Time. Which is an insane sentence I never thought I'd say, but yeah, they probably removed it out of respect for the religion. On to another difference that appears before the game actually starts. The English version calls the delete save file option elimination mode, probably to not break the immersion of the game. But in Japan, they were just a little bit more aggressive with this, calling it Kill Mode, which implies that that version of Link is literally erased from existence. Okay, so here we have some more music changes, but this time I'm going to play a handful of sound effects that were changed. I'm going to be playing the 3 boss noises, the flute, Link's death sound, the enemy death noise, the explosion sound effect, a door opening, Link's sword beam, and the game over theme. Okay, so we're finally in the game. There is a game to play, and there are still some differences between versions. One of the most well-known differences regards the Pole's voice enemy. So a little known fact about the Famicom regards the controllers, and that they're different from the NES controllers. They're permanently attached to the console, but it's the second controller that's of interest of me for now, as it features a microphone. This was barely used. But in the Japanese version of Zelda, if you were in a room with Pole's voice and spoke into the microphone, all of them would die in an instant. The NES, not having any microphone-capable devices, obviously can't replicate this. So to compensate, they're weak to arrows in the NES version. Since I'm discussing enemies, I need to address one of the more substantial changes that involves the Zora enemies, which had their sprites slightly modified across releases. Now, if I had to guess, it was probably for visibility's sake. In the FDS version, it's hard to notice when they're on screen due to the color blending in with the color of the water, while the outline makes it much easier to notice when they're there. Additionally, the eyes were changed slightly, and the enemy's mouth was opened up, likely to explain where the orbs they shoot are coming from. An unintentional side effect of the change involves the way the player perceives the sprite. The FDS version clearly has a little ripple underneath its head to indicate that it's peeking out from underneath the water, whereas the cartridge version has the outline surround this ripple, which makes it look less like a water ripple and more like a really, really fat neck. Here's a massive difference that I noticed while playing, and that's that the Famicom Disk System version has fully fledged loading screens. Now, it's well known that discs are slower than cartridges, due to cartridges using flash memory, while discs use, well, disk memory, which is more complicated than flash. It doesn't sound that bad on paper, but the loading screens are pretty long, especially for a game of its time, and they are super pace-breaking. With this in mind, I still think that the cartridge version is far superior to the disc version, regardless of the audio changes. Speaking of audio changes, we have one last substantial audio difference to discuss. Well, rather listen to, being the ending theme. So, localization was a pretty interesting process for this game, I feel. There were lots of changes made between the Japanese disc release and the American cartridge release. Way more than I would have been able to cover here. Once again, Legends of Localization Book 1, or Shizes if you want a deeper dive. Links in description and all that. But that leads us into our penultimate section. What else is there to cover, I hear you ask? Well, I have a particularly special thing to show you guys today. I have the infrequent pleasure of sharing a special piece of gaming history with you all today. Ladies and gentlemen, there is a prototype, with several striking differences when compared to the final game. Prototypes are badass, and I always love getting a peek behind the curtain at in-development builds of classic games, as I'm sure you all at home do as well. So everyone get ready as we discuss the prototype of The Legend of Zelda. This prototype was released on Christmas 2010 by the website Lost Levels. Lost Levels is a site all about games that never made it to market, their beta content, etc. The site was founded by Frank Cifaldi, who later went on to form the Video Game History Foundation, which is probably the leading force in game preservation around today. And yes, they've released some very cool pieces of localization documentation regarding Earthbound. Alright, just mark that off, there we go. Now that my Earthbound mention quote has been met, let's just get on to discussing the prototype. The exact date of this build is unfortunately unknown, which makes a few certain things hard to determine. We could cross-reference pre-release material with what's seen here to determine a date potentially. But then again, pre-release screenshots aren't necessarily the most accurate timeline, as I previously mentioned due to the fact that available resources use screenshots from several different builds. There are a lot of differences here. So to start, we're going to look at the title screen, which is, quiet? This is one of those things I mentioned earlier that's hard to determine, particularly the why as to why it's quiet. Is this build from between Ravel's Bolero's removal and the final game's main theme's implementation? Was Ravel's Bolero never even implemented in the first place? I don't know, it's hard to say. I'm inclined to say that this build's pretty close to release, seeing as a lot of the changes made between here and release have to do with difficulty modification. But that's besides the point. The title screen's also missing the text scroll and list of items seen in the final game. Since I mentioned the difficulty modification stuff, I should probably get that all out of the way. I won't be mentioning every single enemy change, because that would take forever and be boring as hell. Similarly, I won't be discussing any insignificant changes to maps in general. Having a location for a cave move elsewhere isn't interesting to me, so if you're interested in all that minutia, go to the Cutting Room Floor article and look at their prototype section. They go into a disgusting amount of detail when it comes to documenting this stuff. So if you're one of those sorts that's going to leave a comment that's like, actually painting in the prototype the withrobe that's blue and the final orange, what a lazy video, then go piss your pants elsewhere. I mentioned it here just all in one, so yeah. Here's a pretty cool change. We all know how iconic the Game Over theme is in the final game. Well, in this build it was totally different. And I'm not just talking about a difference in terms of sound hardware either. I mean, it was totally different, using a different and shorter composition that sounds nothing like the final games. If I had to guess why this was changed, I think it has to do with the atmosphere. The finals theme is a lot more calming, and I guess forgiving is a decent way to describe it. It's like the game, through song, telling the player, hey, don't beat yourself up over dying, give it another shot. The prototype's version, on the other hand, is telling the player that everything bad that's ever happened is all their fault and to go screw off. Speaking of music and atmosphere, there's another difference that has to do with the song. Not one that was changed, but one that's entirely missing from this build. The final dungeon of the game uses a unique track to signify its importance, while every other dungeon in the game shares the same, different theme. At whatever point of development this build is from, however, it seems that the normal dungeon's music has yet to be implemented, as every single dungeon uses Death Mountain's theme. Moving on, it's reincorporation time, ladies and gentlemen. Mainly gentlemen, good God. So, remember how earlier I excluded 2 pre-release enemy designs because, quote, we'll be talking about them later? Well, later has come, and I can now show them off. So these are early versions of the Boulder and Guinea enemies. The boulder is the most evidently changed, maintaining a similar but slightly different overall shape, but the detailing is totally different, this one looking much more rugged compared to the final, and entirely missing the white added in on the final sprite. The Genie is a little bit more subtle, having a different expression in the screenshot. He appears angry based on the furrowed eye, and the mouth looking more like a frown of anger, versus the final looking more like it's surprised or something. The most notable difference has to do with the lower half of its body, as he was originally depicted as having 2 legs in this sprite, while the final game gave him a single tail, which historically is more heavily associated with ghosts. As you can probably guess by now, the reason I waited to talk about them is because these early sprites appear in this prototype, and are identical to the pre-release screenshots. The Genie sprite in particular seems to have been around for quite a while before being changed. It even got as far as influencing official artwork of the character. It was probably changed to look more like a traditional ghost, as I mentioned earlier, and the rock sprite was probably changed to make it more clear what it was. They look closer to tumbleweeds here than chunks of rock. Granted, I don't think the final ones look much like rocks either. I remember when I was really little, I thought that they were walnut shells thrown at Link by off-screen squirrels, so I don't think it was communicated the best either way. Speaking of enemies and squirrels, the prototype has a difference surrounding yet another enemy, being the Pole's voice. I mentioned them earlier in the pre-release and localization differences section, but you'll notice that this looks pretty identical to the pre-release sprite I showed earlier, right? Well, you're correct in the fact that they are largely the same, albeit with one massive difference, which involves their eyes. The pre-release and final game have Pole's voices with constantly brown eyes, but during this build, the color of the eyes shared the same palette as Link's currently equipped tunic, a behavior that would be given to the enemy's whiskers in the final game. There are a few more enemy-related differences, and I'm just going to do them all here. First, we have the Stalfos, which is pretty close to finalized, albeit with a few differences when compared to the final game. The head was changed ever so slightly, adding a pixel beneath the eyes while removing one from their shoulders. But the most different part is the foot of the enemy, as it was originally at an angle, while in the final game, they remain flat. This sprite joins the Genie as one of the sprites that likely changed very close to release, as this version of the sprite is seen in the Japanese and English manuals for the game. Next we have Wallmaster, who at this point had all of his spots removed before eventually being restored in the final game. This is interesting, as tied with the Pole's voice, this makes Wallmaster the sprite with the most alterations between versions. The version with the white and dark blue spots in the pre-release screenshots, this textureless version from the prototype, and the final's white spotted design. The final enemy change has to do with the big fella himself, Ganon. For one, in the prototype it doesn't play the special sound effect that plays in the final when you first find him. But the biggest difference has to do with his sprite when he's killed, which uses a totally different palette than in the final game, being gray instead of the final's red. This was probably changed to make him match with the pile of dust that's left over after he's defeated, which across versions is red, like in the final game. Aside from enemies, there is one dungeon room that's found within the build's data, which was unused in the prototype and not even in the data of the final game, being this arrow-shaped room. Alongside it is a variant with a push block found near the tip of the arrow. One of the more infamous changes from this build has to do with arguably the second most famous line of dialogue Zelda has ever produced. It's a secret to everybody. Instead of that, the Moblin says, well, this, which when translated says, I'll give you this, so leave me alone, which is more bribe-esque than the final. The final dialogue feels like a reward for finding a hideout, while in the prototype it's pretty much telling you to piss off, which is just kinda funny. Now, that about does it outside of overworld map differences, which as I said earlier, consist almost entirely of enemy adjustments and caves getting moved around, which would be pretty boring to discuss. But now, I can talk about what I've been wanting to talk about this entire time regarding the prototype. The second quest. This is what I've been wanting to talk about for the entire video. This is one of the reasons I'm so excited about this video in particular, because the implications of the status of the second quest has drastic implications for how the maps of the game were developed. I probably sound insane without context, but just hear me out for a second. Okay, so remember how earlier during the map section, I discussed these two documents. One showing the final map for the main game, while this one shows the final map for the less known second quest. Well, assuming that these were the first and final iterations of the maps, then certainly the second quest's maps in this prototype would match up with how it appears in the document, right? Well, in short, no. It's similar enough, but the layouts of several areas are ever so slightly different, as well as the order in which the player goes through them. In the final game, the order is E, A, L, D, Z, Bell, Spiral 1, Spiral 2, and then the face. The prototype progresses pretty much entirely differently. L, E, A, Z, D, Bell, Spiral 1, Spiral 2, face. So the letter dungeons were all sorts of scrambled at this point. Not a single one remained in their position from this build. And that's not even mentioning the fact that the prototype maps have several rooms that are missing, despite appearing on the document, or rooms that were removed entirely. L has these two additional rooms on the left that were missing from this build. The Bell had a room at the beginning removed, as well as 2 rooms removed from the end of the dungeon. The second spiral design had 2 inner rooms removed, and the face had 2 rooms to the left and the right removed between this build and release. Why is this so interesting? Well, it's because the prototype designs don't match up with the design document we have here, and instead, that document matches up 100% with the map we see in the final version, which, as a result, mean that these design documents are moot points when it comes to determining a timeline of events. These documents, while historically important for them being the in-ink finalization of the maps, we can somewhat definitively say that these aren't the earliest iteration of the map, which as a result has some wild implications. These maps are the sole reason I was anxious to make the assertion that Zelda originally had a longer main quest in the first place. Between this, the pre-release screenshot showing the early version of the map screen for the Moon Dungeon, the mysterious additional room to the left that can't reasonably exist unless what I'm about to say is true, and the fact that I can't really envision any other possibility that The Legend of Zelda, at its earliest point, was much larger than what we see in the final. It's incredibly likely that the game's main quest dungeons were at the very least twice the length we see them in the final game. There's no such thing as a first or second quest. The game was originally one massive quest that had double-length dungeons, before the developers decided to resize the dungeons and then include a second quest. Odds are that that build in question, other than the mock-up, is the earliest build we've publicly seen of the game, based on the differences in layout compared to the final, sprite modifications, and clearly the fact that dungeons at this point were double the length. The second quest couldn't have existed. Now, if only that one screenshot hadn't had the map blacked out, then we would be able to piece together roughly in terms of known builds when the second quest was added. In order from earliest to latest, the earliest is clearly the Mullet Link build, based on the sheer quantity of differences. Then we have the Blue Heart build, which is much closer to the final aside from a few sprites, the dungeon order not being finalized, and some map layout still being tweaked. Then we have the prototype I've been discussing, which is clearly near finalization, aside from the second quest being unfinished, and a few sprites that got changed. And then finally we have the final build, which is the Zelda we all know and love. If only the map of the Blue Heart build wasn't marked out by Sharpie. I don't know why they did it, but it's super weird. If it wasn't for that, we'd be able to place precisely when the second quest began seeing implementation. Until more screenshots crop up, or the Blue Heart or Mullet Link build show up one way or another, we can't pinpoint when exactly the second quest began development. This makes me wonder what exactly the developers were talking about in that one interview though. We have substantial evidence to make the assumption that the game used all the space available, especially if the dungeons were originally twice the length as I theorize. So maybe they're misremembering? I don't want to put words in other people's mouths or anything, and I don't want to question the accuracy of what they're saying. At that point, the difference between what's fact and fiction becomes up to the researcher to interpret, But I feel like there has to be more to this story than what we know. Were they maybe talking about a different document? I don't know. I'm not gonna say for sure, but I think that there's substantial evidence to suggest that the second quest wasn't as happenstance as we previously thought. So come to your own conclusions. I wasn't there, so I don't know 100% myself, etc., etc., etc. That aside, that covers what I wanted to cover for the prototype section, and as you can probably tell by the remaining length of the video, all I wanted to discuss in this video as a whole. I didn't talk about the normal cut content as I usually do, but that's because there isn't much. There's only one unused enemy in the game's data, being a single-headed version of Gleeok, but other than that, everything else is used. The Legend of Zelda is handedly one of the most influential games of all time. Hell, one of the most important games of all time. The precedent set here for how open-world exploration and open-ended progression are still being built upon today. Our industry is inundated with games taking inspiration from this game, as it is the first traditional open-world game ever released. The Legend of Zelda established open worlds and exploration as the key attributes that makes adventure games exciting. Breath of the Wild took those concepts, established years ago, and strove to deliver a game that reinvented the open world genre, creating the golden standard for games of its sort to follow in, and how fun simply using the basic mechanics of the game are, and how jam-packed with content the game is. As Tears of the Kingdom draws ever closer, I can only hope that Nintendo can reinvent the adventure game yet again, heralding in a new era of vertical exploration, alongside a world that grows and changes as the player progresses through the journey in a way that the industry has not seen before, and will serve as the baseline influence for all adventure games to come from this point forward. I've been Mama Luigi, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you all so very much for watching.